The gravy was still steaming when my mother tapped her wine glass and told the whole table that Grandma's farm was finally sold. "We closed last month," she said, glowing like she'd just announced a grandchild instead of a grave. "There's no shame in it, sweetheart. You were never in the will anyway." My sister lifted her glass like it was a toast. 11 people at that table turned to watch what my face would do. Nothing moved on it. None of them knew that the deed to that farm was folded inside a plain manila envelope sitting in my bag, 8 inches from my elbow. And that, in about 90 seconds, I was going to turn my mother's victory dinner into the quietest room in Harlow County. Welcome back to Suspense Calm Stories, where ordinary people get pushed to the very edge of their own families and answer back with paperwork instead of screaming. If a story has ever made you set your coffee down and whisper, "Good for her," you are exactly where you are supposed to be tonight. My name is Addison Ellery. Everyone calls me Addie. I'm 35, and I am a licensed certified public weighmaster for the state, which means 3 counties trust me to walk into their grain elevators, their stockyards, and their scrap yards, and certify that the number on the ticket is the true number, and not the one somebody wishes it were. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because by the time we get back to this table, you're going to understand exactly how a woman who reads scales for a living learned to read a family, too, and bought her own grandmother's farm out from under the people who thought they'd stolen it clean. I have to take you back almost a year to a gray Tuesday in February, when my phone rang while I was up on the catwalk of the Harlow Co-op elevator, running a calibration check on the truck scale before spring planting traffic started. My father's name lit up the screen. I let it ring out once, the way you do when you're mid-check and a semi full of soybeans is idling below you, and he called right back, which told me before I even answered that something in our family had finally cracked loose. My grandmother, Fern Ellery, had taken a bad turn in the night. I climbed down off that catwalk so fast I nearly missed the last rung, told my supervisor I had a family matter, and drove the 14 miles out to the farm with my hands too tight on the wheel. I was the one they called. I am always the one they called. Not my mother, who lived closer into town. Not my sister, Paisley, who lived closer still. Me, because for 11 years, I had been the one who drove out to that farmhouse with Grandma Fern's blood pressure pills, her property tax notices, and a thermos of coffee. For the mornings, her hands shook too badly to manage the percolator herself. Grandma Fern was propped against 3 pillows when I got there, smaller than I had ever once seen her, but her eyes still had that sharpness I had grown up under like weather. She held my hand for a long while without saying much, and then she reached into the drawer of her nightstand and pressed something small and cold into my palm. It was a brass key, worn smooth at the edges, too small for a door and too flat for a padlock. "You'll know where to look when the time comes," she said, and patted my hand the way she used to close out a ledger for the night. Firm, final, done. I asked her what she meant. She only told me to drink my coffee before it went cold, the way she had told me 1,000 times before, and I tucked the key into my coat pocket without giving it the weight it deserved. I told myself it was the medicine talking, the way old people drift sideways into riddles near the end. I was wrong about that, the same way I was wrong about most of what came after, and I would not understand any of it until the farm was already gone. That farmhouse and the old grain elevator sitting empty at the edge of Thistle Creek beside it were the only places I ever felt entirely like myself. I grew up in my parents' tidy brick ranch in town, where every dinner felt like a performance review nobody had studied for. But summers belonged to Grandma Fern and to the Ellery grain elevator my grandfather Wendell had built and run until the day he died. And that Grandma Fern had kept running the scale house of alone for 42 years after him, right up until the co-op finally bought her out and the doors closed for good when I was 19. She used to stand me on an overturned bucket beside the old platform scale on Sunday afternoons and teach me to read a beam balance the way other grandmothers teach cross-stitch. A scale doesn't care who's watching, she'd say, sliding the poise weight down the beam until it settled dead level. It only tells you what's true. Your job is just to read it honest and write it down. I still remember the first afternoon she let me write an actual ticket for an actual farmer, not practicing on an empty beam, but standing beside her at the real scale, 14 years old and terrified, while a man named Otto Brandt waited in his truck to see if the little Ellery girl could get his wheat weight right. I hesitated on the second decimal, and Grandma Fern, standing just off my shoulder, didn't rescue me. She only said, low enough for me alone to hear, "You already read the number, Addie. Write down what you saw, not what you're scared of." I wrote down what I saw. Otto Brandt tipped his cap at the number and drove off satisfied, and Grandma Fern never once brought that moment up again, which from a woman who didn't waste words on things that had already turned out fine was its own kind of praise. That scale house is where I decided what I would be. I got my state weighmaster's license at 23 and built a small independent certification practice out of a converted feed room 2 blocks off the Thistle Creek Square. Because my parents thought any spare money in the family should go toward Paisley's wedding fund, not my licensing fees. Grandma Fern thought it was the finest thing anyone in that family had done with a life in 3 generations. While I drove out to the farm every week for 11 years, my mother, Renata, came twice a year, mostly to ask what the acreage might fetch if Grandma Fern ever wanted to simplify things. Paisley came for holidays and left before the dishes were done. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because of something Grandma Fern said the last good autumn we had together, sitting on the scale house steps with dirt under both our fingernails from turning her tomato bed one more time. She looked at the elevator, then at the farmhouse, then at me, plain as a Tuesday way ticket. "This place goes to the one who never once fudged a number for anybody," she said. I laughed it off and told her not to talk that way, that she had years left in her yet. She didn't argue. She just smiled the way she did when she already knew something I didn't and went back to pulling weeds. I should have asked her what she meant by it. I didn't. I thought we had time. Grandma Fern passed in her sleep 3 nights after she pressed that key into my hand. The funeral was on a cold, bright Saturday, and I planned every piece of it myself. The hymns she loved, the flowers, the obituary, standing at the door of the funeral home, thanking neighbors who had known her 60 years. My mother wore black like a woman, accepting a crown, greeting condolences, with a kind of practiced grace that made my stomach turn. My father, Walt, stood beside her and said almost nothing, which has always been his whole personality. Paisley spent most of the reception on her phone. What I remember most from that day isn't the grief. It's the math. Before the casseroles were even cold, my mother leaned toward me and asked, quiet as anything, what I thought the farm would fetch on today's market. I thought I'd misheard her. Then I watched Paisley drift through the house with her phone raised, photographing the hutch, the quilts, Grandpa Wendell's old scale house desk. narrating numbers under her breath like she was pricing an estate sale nobody had announced yet. "That desk's worth something to a collector," she said. "And the elevator lot, Mom, that's the real money if somebody tears it down for storage units." My father studied his own shoes. Nobody asked who would feed Grandma Fern's barn cat. Nobody asked where her garden tools should go. They asked what it was worth, and I stood in my grandmother's kitchen with my hand in my coat pocket, closed around that brass key, and felt something go cold in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The will reading happened at my parents' kitchen table in April, not at any lawyer's office, which should have told me everything I needed to know before a single word got read aloud. My mother's cousin, Milo Sutter, ran the paperwork. Milo is a part-time notary who keeps a tax and title storefront 2 towns over, and he always smells faintly of drugstore cologne and burnt coffee. He put on his reading glasses, cleared his throat like he was calling a lot number, and told us Grandma Fern had left everything, the farmhouse, the elevator lot, the accounts, to my mother. The devoted daughter-in-law, the document read, who cared for me faithfully in my final years. My mother dabbed at dry eyes. Paisley squeezed her hand. My own name did not appear anywhere in that document. Not as heir, not as witness, not even as a footnote. "You were never in the will anyway, honey," my mother said, and there was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. When she said it, I sat very still, which is a skill I use professionally almost every day of my working life, reading a number off a dial without letting my own face give anything away to the farmer standing beside me. But 2 things were screaming at me under that stillness. The first was that devoted daughter-in-law was a phrase Grandma Fern would sooner have choked on than written down. The 2 of them had circled each other like barn cats for 30 years, and everybody at that table knew it. The second was the signature at the bottom of the page. I have watched hundreds of tired, sick, elderly hands sign weight certifications and delivery slips over the years. I know exactly what a shaking signature looks like next to a confident one, and this signature marched down the page, clean and level and sure of itself. No hesitation anywhere in the loops. The Grandma Fern I had buried 3 weeks before that date could barely hold a coffee spoon those last mornings, let alone sign her own name without a tremor in it. I thanked Milo for his time, took a slice of coffee cake I never touched, and drove back to my office with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind already sorting the day into columns, the way I sort every reading that doesn't add up. Here is the thing about certifying scales for a living. People assume you only care about the number on the ticket. What they don't understand is that the whole job is built on noticing what doesn't add up before anyone else in the room does. A beam that settles half a second too fast. A seal stamped with a date that doesn't match the inspection log. A customer who insists you round in his favor because everybody always has. 2 years earlier, I had flagged a scrapyard outside Millbank for running a rigged platform scale that shorted every farmer who drove onto it by almost 4%. A difference so small most people would never think to question it, and so consistent it had been quietly stealing thousands of dollars a season for at least 3 years before anybody called the state. I caught it because the calibration sticker on that scale was dated 11 months after the machine's own maintenance log claimed the last service had happened. A gap of time that meant somebody had printed a fresh sticker without ever actually opening the housing. I tell you that story now because it matters later, and because it is the reason I already understood long before I ever found any proof. that a family desperate enough to forge a signature was not above dressing up every other piece of paper around it to look clean, too. I sat at my kitchen table that night and laid out everything the way Grandma Fern had taught me to lay out a settlement sheet after a hard-way day. One column for what I knew, one column for what I could actually do about it. 2 years earlier, I had driven Grandma Fern to an estate attorney's office in the county seat because she told me plainly she was getting her affairs squared away. She made me wait in the lobby, which was very like her, and came out an hour later with a sealed envelope and a business card she tucked into her purse. I never saw the documents that day, but I knew they existed because I had sat in that lobby myself and watched the clock. So how did a will drafted by an estate attorney 2 years earlier become a will notarized by Milo 3 weeks before she died, when Grandma Fern hadn't left that farmhouse in 6 months, and Milo had never once set foot on the property? I called him the next morning and asked plainly when exactly my grandmother had signed this new version. He got vague fast. She had me come out. Last-minute change of heart, Addie. Happens all the time. I asked who had witnessed it. He said he'd have to check his file. A notary who has to check whether anyone witnessed a will is a notary telling you something without meaning to. I drove to my parents' house and asked reasonably to see the actual probate filing, not Milo's coffee cake table version. My mother's whole face rearranged itself. "Why would you need that?" she asked, and reached immediately for the weapon she had used on me my entire life, which is making herself the wounded party. "I cannot believe you. Your grandmother is barely in the ground, and you're already fighting about money." Paisley appeared in the doorway, right on cue. "Don't make this ugly, Addie. It's so like you to turn everything into an audit." I asked, evenly, why nobody could just hand me a copy of a public probate filing if there was nothing in it worth hiding. My mother's voice climbed a register. "Because you never let anything go. You've spent your whole life weighing everybody else's grain instead of living your own life, and now you want to weigh Grandma's death, too." I told her I wasn't weighing anyone, that I only wanted to see the paper. "Paper, paper, always paper with you," she snapped. "Some of us grieve with our hearts, Addie, not with a clipboard." My father found something urgent to study in the wallpaper. I looked at the 3 of them and understood something I should have understood years earlier. They weren't confused, and they weren't grieving in some strange sideways manner. They had a plan, and the plan required me quiet, embarrassed, and gone. So I went quiet, but not the way they were hoping for. If you've ever been the one who showed up for every appointment, every hard morning, every form that needed a signature, and then watched the people who vanished decide they'd earned the reward instead, you already know exactly the feeling sitting in my chest right now. Stay with me, because what I did next is the part I still have trouble believing myself some days. Drop the words "true weight" in the comments if you've ever had to prove something that should never have needed proving in the first place. And subscribe to Suspense Calm Stories right now. Because my family had no idea what I actually spend my days checking. And neither will you until we get there. Marguerite Feld's office had a different name on the glass door than the one on Grandma Fern's old business card, since attorneys retire and practices change hands. But her assistant put me through the moment I said my grandmother's name. That told me something before Margot ever picked up the phone. We met the following week in a small office that smelled like old paper and good coffee. Margot was a trim woman in her late 50s, reading glasses on a chain, a handshake that meant business. I set my weighmaster's license on her desk before she even asked for identification, out of habit more than anything, and something in her shoulders eased when she saw it. "You look like her," she said, and opened a file nearly 2 inches thick. 2 years earlier, she told me, my grandmother had come in deliberate and clear-headed and drafted a will. It had been signed, witnessed by 2 of Margot's own staff, and properly notarized the way real documents get notarized. In it, Grandma Fern left the farmhouse and the elevator lot to me, by name Addison, the one who never once fudged a number for anybody. The rest of the accounts were split evenly among the family. Margot read that sentence aloud, and I had to look at the window for a second. Then I told her about Milo's version, about the steady signature on a dying woman's hand, about the date landing 3 weeks before Grandma Fern passed. Margot's expression went flat and professional in a way I have come to recognize, in every profession, as the look of someone quietly furious. "I drafted the operative will," she said. "Nobody ever contacted this office about a revocation. A later will can supersede an earlier one, but only if it's valid. If your cousin's document is what you're describing, then the will currently in probate is fraudulent, and everything filed under it can be challenged." Then she told me something I hadn't thought to check myself, something that made my whole chest go still. "Before we go any further," Margot said, "humor me. Pull up the Secretary of State's Notary Commission database on your phone right now and look up Milo Sutter." I did, sitting right there in her office, because checking a license against a public registry is exactly the kind of thing my own job trains me to do without thinking twice, the same way I check a scales calibration certificate before I trust a single number it gives me. It took 11 seconds to load. Milo Sutter's notary commission had expired 14 months before the date typed at the bottom of that will. He had let his renewal lapse, either out of carelessness or because he hadn't planned on needing it again, and then notarized a legal document anyway, stamping a seal that, on the date it was used, was worth exactly nothing under state law. Margot sat back in her chair. "That," she said, "is not something a court has to weigh carefully against competing testimony. That's a public record with a date on it. Either his commission was active that day or it wasn't, and it wasn't." I sat there staring at my own phone screen, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something besides grief and suspicion. I felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of a number that finally, cleanly, did not add up in anyone's favor, but the truth's. Margot also explained something I hadn't understood until she laid it out plainly. My mother had petitioned the county as executor under an informal, uncontested probate, the kind that moves fast precisely because nobody stands up early to object to it. A court reviewing a will like that checks whether it appears properly signed, witnessed, and notarized on its face. It does not, as a matter of routine, cross-reference the notary's own license status against a separate government database, because almost nobody thinks to ask. The notice the law required going out to family had gone to an old mailing address of mine I'd left behind years back, which meant it reached me late, well past the easy window most people would have used to object. Margot's own office had never been notified at all, because nobody is legally obligated to tell the attorney who drafted an earlier will that a newer one has surfaced to replace it. On paper, sitting alone, Milo's document had looked entirely clean, and the probate had sailed straight through on the strength of that appearance alone. An appearance built, it turned out, on a seal that had already gone dead months before anyone pressed it into the ink pad. The real, executed original, Margot told me, wasn't in her file at all. Grandma Fern had insisted on keeping it herself in a safe deposit box at Harlow County Bank, Box 118, and accessing that box would require the key and paperwork she had apparently set aside on her own. A key. A box. I felt the cold weight of that brass key against my memory before Margot had even finished the sentence. I drove out to the farm one last time before the estate company changed the locks. I still had my own key to the scale house door, the one that sticks if you don't lift it just right, and I let myself in and stood there while the smell hit me, cold metal and old grain dust and her. Everything sat exactly where she'd left it. I went to the windowsill above the old office desk where a battered tin had lived my entire life, stenciled calibration on the lid in Grandpa Wendell's own hand from decades back. The box Grandma Fern had used to store her spare lead scale seals and her weighmaster certification cards for as long as I could remember. I took the brass key from my coat pocket, and it fit a small lock soldered into the tin's underside that I had never once noticed as a child. Under a stack of yellowed calibration certificates, I found two things. The first was a flat brass key of its own, sealed in an envelope marked in her looping hand, Harlow County Bank, Box 118. The second was a letter with my name on the front, just Addie in the same hand. I stood in that scale house holding both, and my hands, which do not shake, even balanced 40 feet up a grain leg catwalk in a stiff spring wind, shook. Grandpa Wendell had bought that tin secondhand the same year he built the elevator, back when Grandma Fern was 22, and still learning to balance a day's tickets to the ounce by lamplight after every truck had gone home. She used to tell me that tin had held more honest numbers than any bank vault in the county, because everybody who drove off that scale on a Friday had paid or been paid exactly what the beam said, no more and no less. Holding it in my own hands 40 years later, in a room that still smelled like her, I understood she hadn't just hidden a key and a letter inside it. She had hidden them in the one object in that whole property that had always meant the truth, on purpose, because she knew I would understand what it meant the instant I found it. I knew what the bank key was for. The letter was a different thing entirely. The letter was her voice, and I wasn't ready to hear it yet, so I did something a little irrational and carried it around unopened for 3 days, telling myself I needed to be strong enough for whatever it was going to ask of me before I let it out of the envelope. While I worked up the nerve to open that letter, I built the thing that would let me actually fight. I formed a limited liability company, not out of any love of secrecy, but because I needed a way to bid on that property without my mother spotting my name and running the price into the stratosphere purely out of spite. I registered Fernvale Holdings, LLC, a name with no obvious connection to anyone in my family, filed properly, reported to the Federal Beneficial Ownership Registry, the way the law actually requires, because I have spent my career telling farmers the rules apply whether or not anyone is watching, and I was not about to become the exception the one time it mattered to me personally. On any public record, only the company name would ever show. Then came the harder part. Money. The farmhouse, the 40 acres, and the old elevator lot had been appraised around $230,000, which is not a fortune in most places, but is a mountain when you have spent 12 years building an independent certification practice out of a converted feed room. I had real savings tucked into the business. I had a small inheritance from Grandpa Wendell I had never touched because Grandma Fern told me years ago to save it for something that mattered. And I qualified for a mortgage in the LLC's name to cover the rest. I sat with my own numbers for 2 nights straight, stress testing every figure the way I would never let a client walk onto a scale overextended and unprepared for what the reading was actually going to say. I could do it, barely, but cleanly. And there was one more piece of arithmetic working in my favor, the kind only somebody in my line of work would think to notice right away. My mother needed cash fast, which meant whoever was setting terms on that sale had pushed for a low reserve to guarantee a quick close. A low reserve is a door somebody left open on purpose. I intended to walk straight through it. Right in the middle of all that quiet planning, Paisley called to share what she thought was good news. She and her husband had put a deposit down on an in-ground pool. The whole package, heated saltwater, a built-in fire pit on the deck, paid for our share of Grandma's estate, money that hadn't even legally cleared court yet. I asked mildly whether that was wise before the sale even closed. That's when she said it, breezy as anything, like it cost her nothing at all. "Oh, come on, if Grandma had left it to you, you'd have just poured every dime into fixing up some old scale nobody uses anymore. You should see the tile they picked, Addie," she went on, already halfway to a new subject. "It's basically going to look like a resort back there." I asked, gently, whether the estate accounts had even finished clearing. "It's basically cleared," she said, which is not a real financial status, and we both knew it wasn't. There it was, the same sentence my mother had used at the will reading, wearing a slightly different coat, as if the 11 years I had spent driving out to that farm were the waste. As if keeping someone's dignity intact at the end of her life counted for nothing at all next to a heated pool deck. I felt the old urge rise up in me to list every drive, every form, every hard morning, and make her understand. I didn't. I have finally learned you don't explain your worth to people who have already decided you don't have any. I just said, "We'll see," and let the silence sit there until she got uncomfortable and changed the subject to pool tile. The night before I was due to meet Margot at the bank, I finally opened Grandma Fern's letter. Her handwriting filled 2 pages, steady in a way her last forged signature had been suspiciously steadier still. She wrote the way she talked, no wasted words, straight to the true number every time. She told me she knew, all of it, the debts my mother had let pile up quietly for years, the hands that would start reaching for that property before the flowers on her own casket had even wilted. "Your mother has always wanted the number to say what she needs it to say," she wrote, instead of what it actually says. "That's the one thing I could never teach her, and I tried." Then she told me what she'd done. The real will, sitting in that bank box with Margot's seal on it. The farm and the elevator lot, left to me, on purpose, in writing, 2 years in advance of anybody needing to argue about it. And then the line I have read so many times now, I could call it out in my sleep. "If they ever stand there and tell you that you were never in my will, you don't raise your voice, Addie. You set the true weight down on the table in front of them and let them do their own arithmetic. That has always been your gift, not shouting, just reading a number honest and refusing to look away from it, even when everybody around you is begging you to round it in their favor. This place goes to the one who never once fudged a ticket for anybody. That's you. It was always you." I sat there a long time after that, and then it came, not the tidy way people cry in movies, but the ugly, hiccuping kind that arrives when someone reaches back from the other side of death and tells you they saw you the whole time. Then I wiped my face, folded the letter back along its worn creases, and understood that I wasn't just buying back a farm anymore. I was carrying out the last clear instruction of the only person in that family who had ever fully believed in me. 2 days later, Margot and I opened safe deposit box 118 at Harlow County Bank. Grandma Fern had thought of this part too. Years earlier, she had quietly added me to the box as a co-holder, my signature already on file, so the box never froze when she died, and I didn't have to wait on any court's permission to open it. Inside was a slim folder, and inside that, the executed original of her real will, signatures and seals intact, witnessed and dated 2 years back, clean as any calibration certificate I have ever signed myself. Margot laid it beside a copy of Milo's version and put her glasses on. She pointed at the witness lines, which named 2 people nobody could quite locate, and then at the notary block, tapping it once. "This part alone ends the argument before it starts," she said. "A commission that had already lapsed can't notarize anything, valid signature or not. Whatever else is true about that will, it was never a legal document from the moment he stamped it." She explained the road ahead, could file to reopen probate, present the original, and the lapsed commission plus the timing would make the fraud almost impossible for a judge to waive off. But that road was slow, months, maybe longer, with my family fighting every inch of it, and the auction would happen on schedule regardless. "So we fight on 2 fronts," I said. Margot took her glasses off, looked at me for a long moment, and almost smiled. "Your grandmother," she said, "would have liked that very much. If you've ever watched something precious slide toward people who never once earned it, stay with me, because this is where the whole thing turns." Comment the words "true weight" one more time if you're still with me tonight, because the auction was still 11 days away, and my sister was about to hand me one more reason to feel good about what I was already planning to do. The auction was held on a cold October morning in a rented conference room at the county fairgrounds, folding chairs and burnt coffee, not so different from 100 Grainway mornings I have stood through myself. I did not go inside. That was the whole point. Instead, I sat in my truck in the parking lot with my phone in my hand and my heart somewhere up near my collarbone, and let an associate from Margot's office bid the number for me, a hard limit written on a card in his pocket, patient as a Tuesday. My mother and Paisley went in dressed like they were headed to a party, already celebrating a sale that hadn't happened yet. Bidding opened low, exactly where I'd predicted, with the reserve set cheap for a fast close. A local rancher wanted the acreage for grazing and pushed it past $160,000 before folding his arms and stepping back. An investor from the city came in strong for 2 rounds and then dropped out entirely, which told me he'd done his homework and decided the number didn't pencil. One fewer variable I had to worry about. Then there was a quiet man in a good coat near the back who kept nodding along, raising the number a beat at a time, patient and unbothered, the way somebody bids when they already believe they know exactly how the story ends. The price crossed 200,000, then 220. My family, I learned afterward, was thrilled every time it climbed, more cash landing in their laps. No idea who was actually driving it or why. At $241,000, the room went still. The other paddle stayed down. The gavel came down half a second later, and the farm and the old elevator lot on Thistle Creek Road belonged, on paper, to Fernvale Holdings, LLC. My phone buzzed. "Sold to your company. Congratulations, MS. Ellery." I sat in that cold truck and pressed my hand over my mouth and made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, the kind I have never once made standing over a scale in front of a customer. My mother walked out of that building minutes later, glowing, already counting the money in her head, complaining to Paisley about the pushy outfit that had bid them up higher than expected. She passed within 30 feet of my truck and never once looked over. She thought she had sold her mother-in-law's farm to a stranger for top dollar. She had no idea she had sold it back to the daughter she had sworn was never in the will. The money moved the way money always moves when people are in a hurry to spend it. My mother took the largest share, and most of it, I would learn later, went straight toward debts she had been quietly hiding from my father for years. Paisley put the rest into the pool. My father took whatever was handed to him and thanked no one in particular. They divided it all at a celebration dinner I wasn't invited to, which suited me fine because every dollar crossing that table was a dollar I had already paid for. Word travels fast in a town the size of Thistle Creek, and by November folks had started asking sideways questions at the feed store and the post office who'd bought the old Ellery place. Was it going to be torn down? Some developer, somebody heard. I kept my answers short and my face pleasant and let the town wonder, because the wondering was going to end on its own schedule, not theirs. I kept my face neutral until the day old Otto Brandt, the same farmer who'd once waited on a 14-year-old's first way ticket, stopped me by the seed rack. Heard whoever bought Fern's place means to keep her garden going, he said, gruff as ever. That true? Someone at the title company had clearly talked. I looked at him and found I couldn't lie about that particular thing. It's true, I said. His old eyes went bright, and he gripped my forearm. Good, he said. She weighed every man's grain honest for 40 years and never once shorted a soul. World could use more of that. Then he went back to his seed order, and I stood there a while, understanding, maybe for the first time all the way through, why I had drained my savings and mortgaged my future for a property I had essentially already grown up inside. Not to ruin my family, not even, really, to win. I bought that farm to keep a promise, to keep her garden in the ground and her name attached to that land. And if anything else came of it, that was just the number rising past what I had walked in expecting to pay. The invitation to Christmas came in early December, and it surprised me. My mother called sweet as pie to ask me to dinner, not because she missed me. I knew her too well for that. She invited me for 2 reasons, and I could hear both of them underneath her cheerful voice. The first was theater. Nothing said, this family has moved on. No hard feelings. Nothing to see here, quite like the prodigal waymaster back at the holiday table. The second was nerves. There had been a whisper around town that some company had been asking the county clerk for the full estate file, including the probate documents and the will Milo had notarized, and my mother wanted to make sure I wasn't stirring a pot that might splash back on her. So she wrapped a leash in tinsel and called it an invitation. You'll come, won't you? She said. It's Christmas. Let's put all this behind us. Then, because she couldn't help herself, because cruelty was a reflex she had never once learned to suppress, she added her little reminder. And let's not have any drama about the farm. You were never in the will, you know that. No sense ruining everyone's Christmas over it. I held the phone and looked out my office window at the string of lights over the Thistle Creek Square. I thought about Margot's petition, drafted and ready to file the first business day after the holiday. I thought about the deed in my desk drawer and the letter tucked in my bag, and I thought, you have absolutely no idea what you are inviting into your dining room. I'll be there, I said warmly. What can I bring? She told me just myself. I told her I'd bring myself, and I meant it. I also meant the plain manila folder that would be tucked into my bag beside the cranberry sauce. Word had reached Milo by then, too. that a company had requested the full estate file from the county, and to a notary whose commission had quietly lapsed years earlier without him ever thinking anyone would check. That is the sound of a floor creaking in a house he thought was empty. He called my mother in a panic 2 days before Christmas. I know because I happened to stop by my parents' house on a pretext, dropping off a poinsettia like a good daughter, and heard her on the kitchen phone, her voice low and sharp. "Stop calling here," she hissed. "Nobody is investigating anything. You did your job, you got paid, now act normal." A pause. "Because if you fall apart, Milo, you take all of us down with you, including yourself. So get a hold of yourself." She hung up hard. I stood in the hallway with my poinsettia and my pleasant face and filed the whole thing away. So Milo had been paid. She'd said it herself. A notary doesn't get a special fee for honest work. The price list is posted right on the wall of his shop. Milo had been paid for something else entirely, and the fraud wasn't just real. It was already cracking from the inside, held together by nothing but my mother's threats. On Christmas Eve, my father did something he had never once done in my life. He came to me. I was closing up the office when I saw his truck idling at the curb, exhaust pluming in the cold. He came up the stairs slow, hat in his hands, and stood in my doorway looking older than I had ever seen him. "Your grandmother," he started, then stopped. He tried again. There were papers I signed as part of the probate. Milo put them in front of me and said I needed to sign as a witness. He turned the hat over in his hands. "I didn't actually watch anybody sign anything, Addie. I just signed where he pointed and figured your mother had it handled." It was as near to a confession as Walt Ellery had in him, a man admitting he had put his name down as having witnessed an event he had never once seen with his own eyes. I waited because I had learned that men like my father say the real thing only in the silence you leave for it. I knew something wasn't right about it, he said finally. I signed anyway. There it was, he knew, not every detail maybe, but enough. He had known something was wrong and chosen the easy quiet over his own daughter, the same as he always had. I felt the old ache, and under it, something steadier. I didn't yell. I didn't absolve him either. "I know you did, Dad," I said. He flinched like I had struck him, which was more honest than anything I could have shouted. He stood there a moment longer, hoping I'd make it easier for him, hoping I'd tell him it was all right. I didn't, because it wasn't. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went down the stairs. I watched his taillights disappear and thought, tomorrow you'll learn the rest. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Christmas morning, I dressed plain, the kind of sensible sweater Grandma Fern would have approved of, and drove across town to my parents' house. The drive I'd made 1,000 times, past the same lit-up lawns and inflatable snowmen, and I was calm in a way that surprised even me. The folder sat in my bag on the passenger seat. I didn't rehearse anything on the way. I had done all my rehearsing already. I thought about Grandma Fern teaching me to read a beam scale on an overturned bucket, about how long I had let people put weight on my back and call it family. And I thought, that's over now. I parked behind Paisley's SUV, sat for one breath with my hands on the wheel, then picked up my bag, felt the corner of the folder press against my palm, and walked up the path to a door where I could already hear them laughing inside. "Before we go in, let me ask you something. If a story has ever reminded you that dignity can be louder than shouting, do me a favor and comment the words true weight one more time, so I know you're still with me. Now, let's go to dinner." The dining room was warm and bright and smelled like a holiday should, pine and roast and cinnamon. My mother had outdone herself, the good china out, candles lit, a centerpiece of red and gold. The whole cast was there, my father at the foot of the table, quiet. Paisley and her husband near the middle, already a glass of wine in. My Uncle Gary and his wife, and to my private satisfaction, Milo, sweating slightly in a holiday sweater, parked near the end like a man who wanted to be close to the door. My mother presided at the head, glowing, refilling glasses, queen of a kingdom she thought was secure. She greeted me with a hug that was all performance and seated me on her right, the place of honor, so everyone could see how gracious she was being to the difficult daughter. I let her. I complimented the table. I passed the rolls. I asked Paisley's husband about his work and admired the tree. By every account, I was a perfectly pleasant dinner guest. Inside, I was as still as I have ever been in my life. We ate, we toasted the season. And then, between the main course and the pie, my mother tapped her wine glass with her fork and said she had a little announcement to make, a bit of family news worth celebrating. Here we go, I thought, here we go. My mother stood, wine glass raised, and the table quieted for her the way it always did. I just want to say, she began, what a hard year it's been, losing Mother Ellery. She pressed a hand to her chest, but we got through it together as a family, and I'm happy to share that we finally closed the sale of the farm last month. It's done. We can all move forward now. Glasses lifted around the table. Paisley said, "Cheers, Mom." Then my mother's eyes slid to me, and the smirk came out, the one I'd been waiting for, the one that needed an audience to work. "I know that's been a sore spot for some," she said lightly, swirling her wine, looking right at me. "But honestly, sweetheart, you were never in the will anyway. There's no shame in it. Grandma just knew who'd handle things responsibly." A few uncomfortable chuckles. Paisley's husband studied his plate. My father went very still. The whole table waited to see if I would cry or argue or slink off the way I always had, the way I was supposed to. I set down my fork. I didn't reach for the folder yet, not yet. I just looked at my mother and let a small silent stretch, the kind that makes confident people start to wonder. Paisley, who never could stand a silence, rushed to fill it. She laughed, that bright, careless laugh she'd had since we were kids, and lifted her own glass toward me like she was doing me a kindness. "Don't feel bad, Addie," she said. "Honestly, it's for the best. You'd have just poured it all into fixing up some rusty old scale nobody needs anymore." There it was again, the second knife, the matching one. As if the 11 years I'd spent driving out to that farm were the waste, as if keeping someone's dignity intact at the end of her life were nothing at all next to a resort-style pool deck. My uncle shifted in, his seat. Milo reached for his water and missed the glass on the first try. I sat there in the place of honor on my mother's right hand and felt the last bit of hesitation leave my body entirely. They had both had their say, in public, on the record, in front of every witness at that table. They had made themselves perfectly clear. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and set it beside my plate, slow and deliberate, the way Grandma Fern used to when she decided a conversation was finished. Then I reached for my wine, took one unhurried sip while the table watched, and set the glass back down. "Can I ask who you sold it to?" I said, in the same pleasant voice I'd used about the rolls. My mother blinked, thrown by how calm I was. "What?" "The farm," I said. "Who bought it?" She recovered fast, because she loved telling this part. "Some company," she said with a little wave. "Fernvale something, an investment outfit. They bid us up nicely, actually, paid well over what we expected." She smiled around the table, collecting her admiration. So really, it worked out for everyone. "Fernvale Holdings," I repeated, like I was making sure I had it right. "That's right," she said. "Why?" I felt the whole strange year arrive at this single point, the funeral, the forged will, the cold truck in that fairgrounds parking lot, all of it funneling down to the next 60 seconds. The candles flickered, the pie sat cooling. 11 people waited, without knowing what they were waiting for. I reached down into my bag, and my hand closed around the folder, and I brought it up and set it on the table beside my plate. I opened it and took out the first page. "This is the deed to Grandma's farm," I said, and laid it in the center of the table, turned so my mother could read it. "Recorded the day of the auction." She glanced down, impatient, then her eyes caught on the owner's name and stopped. "Fernvale Holdings, LLC. "I don't understand," she said, but her voice had already changed. I took out the second page. "This is Grandma's will," I said. "Her real one, drafted 2 years ago by an estate attorney named Marguerite Feld, signed, witnessed, and properly notarized. It leaves the farm and the elevator lot to me, by name." I set it beside the deed. The color was leaving my mother's face now, draining down like someone had pulled a plug. Paisley leaned in to read and went quiet. Milo pushed his chair back from the table an inch. I took out the third page last, and I held it for a moment before I set it down, because this one was hers, in her own hand. "And this," I said, "is the letter she left me. The one that told me exactly what you'd both say tonight, word for word, almost 2 years before you said it." The table had gone so quiet I could hear the candles. Every eye moved from the papers to my mother to me. I folded my hands and let them look. My mother looked up from the papers, and for once in her life, had nothing to say. So I said it for her, in a voice as level as a countertop. "You said I was never in the will," I said. "You were right, because the one I was in, you replaced with a forged one, notarized by a man whose license to notarize anything had already expired 14 months before he stamped it. I checked. It's public record. Anyone can look it up." I let that sit a beat. I have the original, I have the deed, and I have every dollar you all just spent, because I'm the one who bought the farm back. My mother's mouth opened and closed. Then she found her voice, and it came out the way I knew it would, loud, scrambling, furious. "That's a lie," she said, half standing, her wine tipping and bleeding across the white cloth. "That's not Milo, tell her. Tell her that will is real." But Milo was already on his feet, gray as ash, backing toward the door, muttering that he had to go, that he wasn't part of this. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I just put one hand flat on Grandma Fern's letter and looked at my mother across the ruined tablecloth. "You said I was never in the will," I said again, quieter this time. "I am telling you calmly that I was, and I have the paper to prove it, and so does the state, if anyone wants to look up a notary's commission the way I did." The table went silent, not the polite silence of a lull, but the deep, ringing silence of a room where everyone has understood something at the same instant. And no one wants to be the first to speak. Paisley had gone the color of the tablecloth herself, watching the arithmetic cross her own face as she realized the pool going in behind her house had been built with money that was about to be clawed straight back. My father had his eyes shut. My uncle stared at his plate like it might tell him what to do. I looked at my sister, who had laughed and said I'd just have wasted it, and I gave her the only answer that mattered. "Turns out I didn't waste anything," I said quietly. "I bought back the only thing in this family that was ever worth keeping." Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer went off for the second pie, cheerful and absurd, and nobody got up to answer it. I didn't stay for pie. I gathered my 3 pages back into their folder, thanked my mother for dinner with a courtesy that landed harder than any insult, and I drove home through the Christmas lights with my hands steady on the wheel. The rest happened the way Margot said it would, just faster, because a lie cracks quickest once everyone can see it plainly. She filed the petition to reopen probate the first business day after the holiday. We presented the original will and the lapsed notary commission together, and the court took it seriously within the week. Milo's file went straight to the Secretary of State's office, and faced with losing whatever was left of his license and worse, he stopped pretending he had done anything proper. The document he'd notarized fell apart under the first real scrutiny anyone had bothered to give it. With the fraudulent will discredited, the court reopened the estate under Grandma Fern's real will, the one that left the farm to me. My purchase at the public auction stood on its own. I had bought it at arm's length, at market price, as an honest bidder, and a court won't claw a property back from a clean, good faith sale. What got unwound was the money. The cash my family had split had come out of an estate they'd emptied with a forged document, and the court ordered it returned. My mother, who had already spent her share covering debts she'd hidden for years, now owed it back with nowhere left to get it, and the whole careful image she'd built for herself in that town came down in public, which to her was the worst part of all. Paisley had to cancel, the pool billed entirely, and eat the deposit she'd already spent chasing tile samples. My father moved into the spare room, and last I heard was sleeping poorly. I took no joy in the hard parts. I want you to believe that. But I took no responsibility for them either, because I didn't forge anything, and I didn't lie, and I didn't reach for $1 that wasn't mine. As for me, I kept the farm both ways. It turned out the way I'd planned, and the way the law eventually decided. The auction had made me the owner. The real will made me the heir. 2 different roads, the same front door. That spring, I drove out to Thistle Creek Road, fixed the crooked porch step, and turned the soil in Grandma Fern's garden with my own hands. Otto Brandt came by with tomato starts and didn't say much, which was its own kind of blessing. I reopened the old scale house too, not as a business, just as a freeway station, a few mornings a week for the small farmers around Harlow County, who can't always afford a certified reading and end up trusting numbers they shouldn't have to trust on faith alone. I put a small brass plaque above the door. The Fern Ellery Scale House. Honest numbers, free of charge. I left the door open for my father once, with a single condition. It's open, I told him, when you're ready to be honest about the rest of it. He hasn't come yet. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. Either way, the garden's in, and the old beam scale still settles dead level every time I check it, exactly the way she taught me to read one. Here's the thing I learned, standing in that quiet scale house that used to be hers. Family can vote you out of the story all they want, but the people who actually stay are the ones who get to keep the land, and the name, and the truth that goes with both of them. That's where I'll leave it tonight, the smirk, the toast, the 3 pieces of paper on the Christmas tablecloth. If you've ever been the one who stayed while others showed up only to collect, this story was for you. So do one quiet thing for me this week. Go check the paperwork on the things that matter, the deeds and the wills and the licenses everyone assumes are still valid, gently and early, long before you ever have to raise your voice over any of it. Comment the words true weight if you made it to the end with me tonight. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Suspense Calm Stories, because there's always another family, another table, and another number waiting for somebody brave enough to read it honest.